Hello, everyone. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, and that's Community Advocates for Young Learners. It is really my honor to welcome you to the CAYL Catalyst Webinar Series. Our goal is to bring you relevant, timely, and immediately actionable topics of interest about young children and the people who raise and teach them. We are the CAYL Institute, and on today's call, there are dozens of community-based leaders and elementary school principals who have participated in intensive programs offered by the CAYL Institute since we were established in 2003. Welcome to them and to each and every one of you for joining us on this important topic today. Our CAYL webinar series are on topics that we offer both as an invitation and as a challenge, because especially now, it's critical for us to understand the importance of thinking simultaneously about the field's present, as well as our aspirations for the future. Now is the time that we must engage with each other in order to nurture our collective thinking about the quality of life for our children and families, as well as how we can advance early childhood education as a field of practice. This webinar is brief. It's only 1 hour, but we invite your questions and reflections throughout the presentation. So please use the chat function and the Q&A to let us know what you're thinking. And in response to popular demand, at the end of this webinar, you will have the opportunity to click a link to go onto Zoom if you want to ask our keynote speaker or panelists a question or discuss these ideas further. So today's important topic is about families and the role of families. And so let's think together about children and families. Today, we realize that children are growing and changing, and families are too. Our intention is to invite you to think about how we as a society want to influence the trajectories of possible futures for this next generation of children and families. As we look into the horizon and think about young children today, these are children who are part of a generation we call Generation Alpha. We observe that there are very many megatrends that characterize their lives. They are growing and maturing in an age when life is going to have to be navigated in the face of constant and disorienting change for which there are no known answers. Here's 4 quick insights into their family lives. What do you think? First of all, Generation Alpha can expect to live among many more generations in their family than was typical in the past. And this is because that lifespan is increasing. In 1900, the global lifespan was 31 years of age, and today it's 72 years of age. And if you're 65 years old today in the United States, you can probably live to 85 years old and beyond. That's why Generation Alpha is going to have more opportunity to participate with more generations of their own families. The second thing we can think about is that young children today are living in smaller and constantly evolving families. While the number of generations living is increasing, in the United States, the average number of children in each family is shrinking, and the families in which they live are increasingly complex and diverse. The third thing we think about when we think about families is that Generation Alpha offspring are more likely to be only children because the one-child family is growing and gaining ground. These children and this whole idea of having smaller families is really due to increases in the way people can control fertility, as well as increased employment opportunities for women and the escalating costs of raising children. When polls ask people why they aren't having more children, people say that the main reason is because of the cost of raising children. And housing, followed by childcare, education, and food are the largest expenses when you exclude college costs. The US Department of Agriculture tracks how much money people spend on their children. And what they're telling us is that the average family, the average middle-class family, is going to spend over $13,000 per year to raise their child. And one last thing I want you to think about as we're entering this conversation about families, their strength and resilience, is that alpha children in families today can expect to live in very varied family compositions, much more likely than their elders did. There's a series of studies by the Pew Research Center that have found that parents today are less likely to be married than they were in the past. They're more likely to be older, and they're more likely to have some kind of college education. So our children are being raised in families and in a nation in which there is no dominant family form. The diversity of family types is a result of the overall drop in fertility, smaller families, a decline in two-parent households, and the rise of single-parent households, including single dads who are raising children. These families are fluid. So in the United States, what we see is that non-marital cohabitation and divorce, along with remarriage, make family structures that continue to evolve throughout the child's life. So one study found that over a 3-year period, 30% of kids under the age of 6 had already experienced at least one major change in their household structure because of divorce, separation, marriage, cohabitation, or death. And this is going to be even more prevalent in the years ahead. So how do we address these generational changes in family life in the best interest of children? In my view, we need to elevate the voices of families. We need to ask ourselves, will we, when we, and how should we address family needs for social and economic support? We're going to have to revisit educators' relationships with families and the role of public policy in families' lives. So let's acknowledge that families and educators and public policies aren't always on the same page. Issues related to race are just one example of this disconnect. And we're also going to have to pay more attention to the fact that public policies matter to families. And our inaction on the public policy front for families has consequences. Relative to comparable nations, research shows that the United States has fallen well below comparable nations and how well we support children and families. Research also shows that parenting is a happier and more deeply supported activity in other countries. Our relatively low investments has consequences. And among those consequences are the impact on infant mortality, as well as on achievement gaps that start early and get worse over time. So let's listen to our panelists to find out more about families in this new generation. Let's look at the diversity of our families, income security questions, the roles of gender in families, and public policy needs. Let's also pay attention to the wide diversity and the fluidity of families, focusing on families' assets and their strengths so that we can achieve an outcome of having increased opportunity and prosperity for everyone. In our webinar today, we're going to hear from a pioneer in this work, an esteemed leader in this work, Ellen Galinsky. She is going to be followed by 2 practitioners who are paying a lot of attention to what's happening to families today. We have Roberto Jiménez Rivera, who's going to speak, as well as Tamara Johnson. Following their talks, we're all going to come back and have a panel conversation to talk about how we can change the game for children and families. So let's get started by hearing from our first speaker, Ellen Galinsky. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I am going to share my screen right now. I think this is going to work. Let's just see, I got a message. Yes, it's going to work. And I want to do a slideshow so you don't see my messy computer screen. There we go. I'm actually going to share a new post-pandemic vision for families, but also for all of us who work for families. For those of you who know me, you know that I'm always on one journey or another trying to figure out things that I think matter. I feel like a research adventurer. Throughout my life, I've asked what I hope are the important questions and look to both research and to people's life experience to find the answers. The journey that I'm on right now in the long term, the last 7 years, has been to have Mind in the Making grow up and to look at what's happening to children and adolescents 9 through 18 years old. So I'm going to share parts of that when I speak to you, as well as looking back at early childhood, and have been spending a lot of time looking at the transition to parenthood as well. The other journey that I've been on most recently is to talk to about 30 of the leaders in the early childhood and adolescent fields in the United States, from the major organizations and major thought leaders and researchers, to figure out what we should do post-pandemic. And the reason is that I've been asking that question is that so many people have been thinking of the pandemic and the period of racial reckoning as a pivot point. So is it or not? And in the interviews that I have recently done with the CAYL Institute, with Dan Worry, who's been my partner in this project, also funded by the Foundation for Child Development, so thank you, as well as our foundation, the Bezos Family Foundation. We've asked people, is the pandemic a tipping point, a pivot point? Are the kinds of changes that people want to see going to happen? And are we going to make them happen? And universally, we've heard yes, that it is a real changing point. I think Robert Hull from the National Association of State Boards of Education said one thing that pretty much everyone says, which is a crisis is an awful thing to waste. We really need to take advantage of this crisis. He also said we didn't have a level playing field to begin with. So we have other issues like race and education, the gap in education to deal with. But let's use it, put them together in closing the gap. I also loved what Patricia Kuhl from the University of Washington said about this. She said, we've been spending a lot of time alone with our own thoughts, and we've been having to look up close at what works and what doesn't work. And she said she thinks this is causing more reflection. And now that we've learned that early childhood is so important, I feel we have to not just see what could happen, but act on it. So the next question that we've asked people are, how are children, how are families, and how are professionals faring during the last year and a half? And here I'm going to start with Phil Fisher at the University of Oregon, who last February and March realized that this was an unprecedented time, and it would really be important to look at on a regular basis, because things can change so quickly, what is actually happening for both children, families, and professionals. Here they're looking at a group of children and families, and they found a sample that can be weighted and is nationally representative, and through working with organizations. And first they surveyed them every week, and now it's every other week. And what they saw is that at first there were about 20% of families that were experiencing a material hardship, at least one material hardship. In July, when the CARES funding went out, that went up to 40%. And it stayed at 40% ever since. That that's for all families, but for families who are families of color, that number has been 60%. So an awful lot of people are experiencing material hardship in one way or another during the pandemic. Myra Jones-Taylor from 0 to 3 said there are cascading effects, that when families are suffering, children can suffer as well. So we asked Jack Shonkoff what the impact of this is from a pediatrician point of view. And he said there are two things that are true. One thing is that that this pandemic, and you're going to hear me talk about this all the way through, has made what has been hidden in plain sight much more visible. That's why we have a mist on the Grand Canyon. And let me say a word before I say what Jack has said. The reason that I have the Grand Canyon pictured here is something that Linda Darling Hammond said to me the other day. She said, I feel like I'm on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I'm looking down at the canyon below. I'm looking down at the river, the abyss, but I can see over to the other side. And that's the vision of what we should do. And let's just hope that we all do it. So that's the analogy that I'm going to use throughout. Jack said that that even though we have statistics, and those statistics will show that children of color, children who were in poorer neighborhoods, whose families had fewer resources, are doing less well. He said, we all know that within that group, some children are going to do extremely well. And that's the important thing, that that there's a huge diversity. It's that, and that what we need to look at is what helps children do well. So another question that we've been asking is there a learning loss? And that's been talked about widely. And Ralph Smith, I think, was one of the first people from the Campaign for Grade Level Reading to coin that term of learning loss. And he did it to honor the families whom they were talking to in the campaign, the more than 400 communities that they work with, who were feeling like their children were falling out of love with school, who were struggling with school, trying to figure out how to do remote learning, how to be essential workers and pay for their families. Some people have lost jobs. So he feels that it's very important to call it a learning loss. That said, when they ask people at the University of Oregon study that Phil Fisher has led, they said that families are actually more concerned with social emotional learning, with what their children have lost by not being with other kids and in regular social situations during the pandemic. Ralph also points to the fact that enrollment is going to be uneven, that some kids had lots of good experiences, some kids had less, and that there's going to be an enrollment hesitancy. But here I'm going to turn to Valora, who said, let's stop thinking about loss. Let's think about opportunity. This is our chance to reinvent the system. And I also loved what Ioma Iruka from the University of North Carolina said. She said, we always talk about whether the kids are ready for school, whether the families are ready. We're looking at individuals and how they're faring. Let's look at the institutions of society. Are they ready? So with that frame on, and with Valora's admonition to stop talking about a horrible year and a lost generation, stop that negative language. Let's look at what the vision can be. And we're going to look at it based on child development knowledge. I think that's so important. Going to Pat Kuhl, she talked about how the brain has different parts, as we know, that are specialized for different kinds of learning, language learning, social learning, emotional learning, all of those sorts of things. But when the brain is working, it's all working together. There's not just a part of the brain that is doing social learning, or a part of the brain that is doing emotional learning, or a part of the brain that is doing content or academic learning. When the brain is really working, we are all engaged in learning. So we need to look at the concept, if we're using child development learning, to look at the notion of engagement in learning. I think the danger here is the notion of the empty vessel that children have missed a lot. So we're going to try to fill them up, like pour knowledge into the empty vessel. I think that that is a huge danger. Boot camps or remediation. It's not that we don't pay attention to the differential experiences, but we do so by individualizing. Jack Shonkoff said, one of the reasons, and any family will tell you this, that there's so many differences is that even with the same kind of experience, families are different, children are different, and we need to be able to individualize. And what does that mean? And I loved what Deb Leong said there, which is that we often think of individualizing as putting children in different groups. Here's the higher reading level, here's the lower reading level. But the kids who are in the lower reading level start to feel badly about themselves because they know what the robins and the bluebirds really mean, if that's the terminology that's used. So what she's doing, I think, is something that is so important to education, which is to talk about putting children together with, they use study buddies, and they're of all different levels. And those kids can help each other in different ways, the study buddies. And that way, one group isn't stigmatized. And that's another way that kids can practice what they're learning. And they can learn that making mistakes is a part of it, that it takes practice to learn. So we need to base what we're doing on engaging children, on individualizing, using the best of child development knowledge. I have found in my own research for years that parents and teachers who understood how kids develop are going to do the best. And Beth Bai, who's the commissioner in Connecticut for early childhood, said, I think if I had any wish for what happens after the pandemic, everyone would know about child development. We need to know what those 36-month-olds are like, and what those 48-monthers are like, and what those 24-monthers are like. We need to base our vision on being intentional and understanding about child development. Moving along, one of the things that has been hidden in plain sight, although we tend to talk about social emotional learning, is that we can't really separate out social emotional learning. Pat Kuhl talks about how they work together really in a good way. What she talks about is the fact is that social is the gateway to learning. It's the key to unlocking the learning that children do. And we all learn through relationships, but we learn when we're emotionally engaged. And that's what leads to cognitive learning. So they are separate in the sense that each has a different role. But when children are learning, they're learning together. I think that people have recognized when we ask what kids need, they've recognized the importance of the kinds of things that are often called social emotional learning, like making sure that kids feel that they belong, or making sure that kids feel safe, or making sure that kids feel respected, or making sure that kids feel supported or families feel supported. I think that there's an underlying strata, and I think this is something new in the work that I'm just about to release in my new book, The Breakthrough Years, which will be out in about a year, which is that we need to think about this, if we're really looking at child development, as meeting developmental needs. Developmental needs, what are they? They're the things like, if you think about physical needs, biological needs, we need food, we need water, we need shelter. Those are the things we need to survive. A developmental need is something that we need to thrive. And those are things like to belong, that we all need. We know it best when it's taken away from us. If we go into a group and we don't feel we belong, or we're not really safe there, that's when we know that it actually is a need that will help us thrive or not thrive. And I think that we need to look at now, when we think about families and institutions that work with families, we need to be able to assess the environment. And are we helping children feel that they belong, feel supported, feel respected, have some autonomy, gain competency? Those are some of the developmental needs. Be challenged so that they can be stretched to learn, and develop as individuals and learn to contribute and give back. Those are what I think the most important needs are. The third vision over there in blue on the right side is that we can't really separate out, the danger is what's hidden in plain sight is we can't separate out content from skills or mindsets, that all of those go together. The danger here, I feel, is that we're going to just focus on content. We're going to pay most attention to the content that children learn. I think if we don't promote life skills as a way of learning, as in addition to content and mindsets, we're not going to do as well. Comer Yates in Atlanta had one of my favorite stories when we were doing, when Dan Morey and I were interviewing people. He told about a group of 3-year-olds who had to walk by a group of 2nd graders who were taking a test in a school. And how did the teacher get them to be quiet to walk past them? And he does as an exercise, asking teachers what they would do to help those littler kids be quiet so that they wouldn't disturb the kids who were older taking a test. And teachers came up with some things like, tell them that there's a dragon in there and it'll get them, or a monster in there, it'll get them, or just tell them to say shush. He says what people don't do is to ask the children, what ideas do you have to get from here to there without disturbing the 2nd graders? The kids then are learning a skill. They're not just learning what to do and how to behave. And in a time where discipline is going to be much more important, we need to pay attention to helping children learn life skills, often through the way we discipline them. And Aaron Ramsey and I at the Bezos Family Foundation are now engaged in a project with First Book, where we're going to do lots of tips for how you discipline in ways that promote life skills. We're also going to share information about mindsets, particularly an opportunity mindset, which means not only that you think you can change, you can affect change, but you yourself can do it. Change is possible and I can do it. And we call that an opportunity mindset. So what's the 4th vision? We know that this is a period of racial reckoning. Jack Shonkoff talked about what has been invisible to people. The everyday kinds of aspects of discrimination have become much more visible. The danger here is that we're going to stereotype kids. We're going to say to kids, kids of color or kids who are low income, that, well, we think you're doing more poorly. And what we know from the best programs that deal with this is that it's important to, again, Belora's words, to promote what's positive, to promote a positive ethnic and racial identity. I ask a lot of people how you would walk into a classroom or a home and know that that was happening. And it was that people wouldn't think that they were colorblind, think that little kids don't understand race. They would know that they do. And you would see artifacts around that celebrate the positive racial and ethnic identity of that child and those children in the classroom, and more. We're doing work at the Bezos Family Foundation. We'll be doing tips on this as well, so stay tuned. The next vision is that a lot of people have called it a traumatic time. But my worry there is that we have a traumatic focus. And I know that if we have a traumatic focus, we tend to stereotype kids. We see them as a result of the worst thing that's happened to them, and we don't understand what they can do. The best programs that are dealing with trauma build on the assets. They ask, instead of what went wrong today or what's not going well, they build on what do you really love about your child? What is going right in your family? And that's how we create change. The 6th vision is that parents are at the center. We only have to think about the Zoom calls that we've all been in for work, or the Teams calls where we see the kids in the meeting. Ralph Smith told me that in the communities, the superintendents you were talking about is that they had really thought about that child walking to school alone and coming there as an individual. And now they're seeing that children are a part of families, and we all have to see that families are at the center. Elaine Zimmerman from ACF in the New England district said, where did we forget parents in policy, in family-centered policy? And Valora, you just talked about the importance of policy. Our danger there, the abyss that we could fall in, is that we think about involving parents. Parents are involved, we stop them from being involved. I've always called that like racist and ageist parentist. Go into a lunchroom and listen to the way parents are talked about. That will tell you a lot about the culture around family. The positive vision that we can see is to use parents and youth to help us know where we're going to go. Again, Elaine, who one would expect to do this, and because that's been her mission throughout her career and life, has brought parents in the planning and youth in the planning of how we're going to create this post-pandemic world that we all want to see happen. And that leads to my seventh vision, which is that we've seen hiding in plain sight that silos don't work. Kwesi Rollins from the Institution for Educational Leadership, and who's worked on community schools, said that in his experience, the communities that really falter didn't know, weren't connected with the community agencies that could help family get food or know where the children were who weren't showing up for school. And that was really to their detriment. If the families didn't know where the children were, if they weren't connected, there wasn't a community that was involved together. Children were seen as truant if they weren't in school, versus calling up the organizations in the community that could help children help children if they didn't have the resources to learn online. We have the abyss that we could fall in there is that we've separated care and education. We've got to bring them back together. And we've separated children from family, and families and children from communities. Our way forward is to engage the whole child, the whole family, and the whole community. And that's something that we know how to do. So I think these principles that I've just talked about are the guiding principles that will help us have the strength and resilience to build the kind of world that we can see over there on the horizon, and that we can make happen. Thank you very much. Now, it's my pleasure to stop sharing my screen and to turn to Roberto for his comments.
All right. Thank you so much, Ellen, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you. Until about a year ago, I was coming at these problems from a purely, legislative perspective. As a school committee member here in Chelsea and a political organizer in the Boston Teachers Union. But then kind of the best thing happened in the middle of the worst year, and I became a dad last July. And so now that we're moving out of this pandemic, I now have an almost 1-year-old, and so I really need childcare. And in a few years, we're going to need early education services. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming at this from. And a little bit more context for those of you who don't know, Chelsea is just north of Boston, just across the water. It's the smallest city in Massachusetts, only about 2 square miles. The city itself is about 2/3 Latinx, and our schools are even more so, about 90% Latinx. It's one of the poorest cities in the state. And because of that, and then other racial injustices, it was also the first epicenter of the pandemic here in Massachusetts. And, even though we're living right next to Boston, which is such a major tech hub, many of our families don't have access to high-speed internet because it's, too expensive for them. Many of them live in multi-generational housing, which exacerbated the pandemic effects. And now at the tail end of the pandemic, many of them are rightfully concerned about returning to school. Before their children are vaccinated and all that. So all in all, a community that has suffered through racist policies around environmental justice, urban planning, education, you name it, for decades, but also an extremely resilient community that has many strengths, right? There are many tightly knit communities that act as extended families for many of the people who immigrate here, right? With no other family, who then come here and find that community. So it's just a very welcoming community that has multiple strong nonprofit organizations that are affecting policy at the state and national level, and also thousands of essential workers who kept our economy running when the pandemic was at its worst. Whether it was healthcare, transportation, food distribution, all these things. So then, when I turn and look at our early education system here, we have two basic types. So the first one is that we have a half-day pre-K, which is free, and a full-day pre-K that it's $15 a day to cover the after-school portion until 5 p.m. And the demand for the two is strikingly different. So we actually just recently voted to remove the lottery process from the half-day pre-K because there's just not enough demand to fill all the spots. So having a lottery was just unnecessary. On the other hand, the full day pre-K, we still have a lottery because the wait list just gets longer and longer. So we know that parents need access to childcare for these ages, right? And to that early education piece. And you know, like almost everything else in education, I think that, you know, this really comes down to money and having community input into what that money is used for. Right? So when we talk about money, right, we think about resources for childcare, for early ed. They're currently not equitable, right? Partially because we rely so much on people paying for it, right? Whether it's out of pocket or through local taxation. So the way that we fund education is primarily through local property taxes. So it means that districts with more money have the ability to better fund their early ed, right, and to better support those systems. And people in those communities also have a higher disposable income, so they can also afford better childcare options prior pre-K, during pre-K, after. So one thing that I'm constantly thinking about is what can we do to ensure that people in those low-income communities have access to childcare before, during, and after early ed, and making sure that it is a high-quality service, right? In my opinion, the solution to that is for the state to step in with funding and to guarantee to all children high quality early education and childcare in the same way that we currently guarantee K-12 education for all students. And so then, of course, comes the question of community input. And I appreciate that Ellen brought up the importance of family engagement because this work is so crucial. And even the communities that are doing good work in this area, there's still so much more to go, especially in those communities of color where parents are just not as engaged for whatever reason it might be, right? It might be that they're working 2, 3, 4 jobs sometimes and just like don't have the time to think about the schooling system. We also sometimes see a culture of parents who might be here undocumented or who come from other countries who in those places you don't really get input in your schools, right? So they don't think that they should have a voice or have a voice. So I think like it's really important that we're continuing to do that work. And one note here that I think is just a really great example is that through my work with the Boston Teachers Union, we've been doing a lot of family engagement there. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which districts can engage with educator unions to really work together and engage families together so that it doesn't feel like kind of just, disjointed efforts from both sides. But anyway, going back to community priorities, even though I think the resources should come, from the top and really be coming from the state or federal government, different communities are going to have different priorities for their children. So people in Chelsea, because of the high concentration of Spanish speakers, may want programming for kids in Spanish, right? And so I think that we have to allow for some form of local democratic control over those programs so that it's not just a one-size-fits-all policy. And that also allows us to approach these supports from a position of community strengths, right? Instead of looking at some communities as strong and others as lacking in whatever that might be. And that kind of brings me to my, this other point that as we discuss systemic change like this, one of the most important things is thinking about anti-racism, right? And decisions about these issues are not race neutral because the status quo is inequitable. So I think that for that reason, but especially for folks in more privileged communities, we have to be mindful about how what you want can be perpetuating inequities in other communities because they don't get to have what your community has. And so I think that in marginalized communities, we should be making sure that those people have the power to shape their future in the same way as folks from those privileged communities. They've never had that power in the form of resources, and these communities deserve that opportunity. And often we hear a lot of people talking about the failure of our schools, but what we haven't done is actually reach the root cause of this issue, which is that lack of funding. So now I'm going to just quickly ask you to think about the best K-12 school that you can think of, right? Whether that's an elementary, a middle school, or a high school. It can be maybe public, maybe it's a private school, right? Wherever you are in the country, I'm sure there's a school that stands out as amazing. Here in Massachusetts, it might be something like Wellesley Public Schools, right? Very, very well resourced, highly ranked. Out in the West Coast, it might be something like a Harvard Westlake, right? Maybe St. Albans if you're in the DC area, right? It doesn't much matter what school it is. I can guarantee you that if every student in our country had the resources that those students have, outcomes for all students, even the poor students and students of color, would be way better. So what I think we need to do is just have to shift our mindset from wanting to educate all students cheaply, right? And making sure that we are asking ourselves, what would it take for us to push our government to properly fund the education of every child in this country from the moment that they, can go somewhere without their parents up until the moment that they graduate 12th grade, maybe until they graduate college even, right? And so that's what I'm fighting for, primarily in the K-12 education space, but also as we expand government spending to early ed and childcare, I think it's really, really important that we make sure that every child has access to high quality services. And so with that, I'd love to pass it along to Tamara and also get her thoughts on all this.
Thank you very much. First, before I begin with my comments, I just wanted to say that resilience is just a strength of the families in our communities. They innately bounce back pretty quick. And so, as Valora has mentioned, as Ellen has mentioned, I think it's time for us to start to think about the positives and put our mindset in that space of building more resiliency in our children and families. Over the past 14 months, we've lived in very high stress times with lots of uncertainty, which those two coupled together can create mistrust. So one of the things I think we need to focus on as we think about Ellen's new vision and guiding principles is think about how we build relationships with children and families. I know there are lots of programs or schools that pride themselves on how they engage with families, but I think we're at a point where we need to be much more intentional about how we build relationships with children and families. I think another thing that we need to look at as we move forward with our work in the sector is to make sure that we are genuinely caring about people. I know one example is when the pandemic hit, I think everybody, went straight to layoffs. For those of you who know me, I make things work. I'm the problem solver. So, changing our mindset, it was layoffs and versus how to make it work. And lots of folks opted on the layoff sides. Some folks didn't have a choice, but I live in that world of I was not going to let COVID win. And so figuring out how to make things work for children, families, and our early childhood educators. I think also now more than ever, we need to meet families where they are and uplift them. I think the times of us trying to mold families into goal setting that fits programs or meets federal requirement outcomes needs to take the back seat, and we need to be a little bit more intentional of how we plan for meeting our families' needs. Just like we talk about intentional instruction in classrooms, we need to also be intentional about how we meet our families and how we uplift our families. It's not necessarily going to fit into certain standards. However, I think we can be creative. I think COVID has definitely taught us that we can dream big and do things differently, as the whole world had to do things differently. And I absolutely think it's a time, as I believe Valora mentioned earlier, now is the time for us to take a look at the assets that we have and just uplift those assets. Now I'm going to talk about educators. As educators, we've, for many, many years, just tried to remember and depend on the things that we knew or how we were raised and how we grew up. This goes back to my example about meeting families where they are. I think the times of us relying on what we've known to be true for the way families function, as Valora mentioned, is absolutely not, we're not in that space anymore. So now we need to be a little bit more intentional about, as educators or as a sector, as a profession, and anyone who functions in the space of work that has to do with children and families, we have to remember we are meeting people where they are now. I think of this example all the time of, as a kid, I remember, you need to be on the block when the street lights came on. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. However, where can we meet families where they are and have that same concept? In what way do we move people forward in those concepts that we may have grown up and known about? But what do they look like now, and how do we uplift families in those spaces? One other thing I think is extremely important, and this goes back to some things that Roberto said about in regards to equity, is I think the first step is understanding and acknowledging where we are, where we have been, and where we need to go. You know, Ellen brought this up, and I think one of the things that happened when COVID hit and all of the injustice that was happening is people didn't understand why some things existed. Either they knew why and ignored it and now had to face it, or they just didn't know. And I am of the belief that some people really did not know because they lived in a different world than most of us, especially folks of color. And so I think, you know, as we move forward, we need to think about what those systems look like that are holding folks back. We need to pay more attention to women in the workforce. That was another thing I think was very apparent, especially in childcare, as to how we function, what childcare, early care and education really looks like in communities, and who are the folks doing the work on a daily. So I think those are the things that, one of the things that we need to look at. I think you know, when we think about policy, we absolutely need to talk about family leave policies, as well as workforce policies, period. And one of the last points that I want to make is in regards to the implications for teaching and raising children. It absolutely takes a village. I know people hear me say that all the time. I just absolutely believe in that. The village is real. And so as we move forward, I think in everybody's work, we absolutely are going to have to pay attention to two-generation approaches. At the beginning, Valora spoke about the Alpha generation and how they will live through the spans of multiple generations. And so I think that's where that village mentality is going to kick in most, is that you need to understand that everybody plays a part in not just raising our children, but what our communities look like. So everyone needs to absolutely quickly understand what that village mentality is, what it takes to make that work, how it looks in the classroom, how it looks at home, how it looks in community, so that we can continue to focus on the strengths and building all the assets that we can in our children and families. And now that you've had the opportunity to hear from myself as well as all of the other panelists, very good information was shared, and I'd like to move us into group discussions.
Thank you so much, everyone. There's lots of questions and comments in the chat, and so I want everyone to know that in the chat box, there is going to be a link to the Zoom where immediately at 5 o'clock, you'll be able to ask questions of the panelists and speakers. And so bring your questions there. I'm going to connect just to what Tamara just said about a village mentality. And one of the things I've noticed in the pandemic is there's been a lot of separation of the ideas of childcare and early childhood education. In fact, one of the things I think we're going to have to push back on is people have really been talking about childcare. Oh, excuse me, they've been talking a lot about daycare. So there's a lot of repairing that we're going to have to do with this village mentality. I think as parents, we don't think about our children in these segments, so to speak. And people have talked about, Ellen talked about the separation. Roberto talked about it as he's faced this even as a new dad. How do we bring all this together for the benefit of families across the developmental lifespan of families? Because families have developmental stages too, as Ellen has pointed out in her work. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Real quick. I think, I think and kind of the way that I broke it up, I think folks might have thought that I was also thinking about it separately. I think the main issue, in terms of the policy side, is that most policymakers think of it as separate, right? So like we have established right now, up to now, that education, right, is a right, and we think about K-12 education when we talk about that. We don't think about college. We don't think about early ed, right? But I think that as the conversation has moved forward, right, we're now starting to have the conversation about college, right, as part of this right that we have. And I think that we need to continue pushing and advocating to make sure that we can continue to kind of link all these different things that are currently disjointed, to make sure that as policymakers are thinking about the future of all these different issues, that they're properly funding it in the same way, and not saying like, well, we don't have to think about, these kids before they get to kindergarten, which I think is ridiculous, right? And thinking, we don't need to think about these kids after they graduate 12th grade, right? Like these things should all be interconnected and should all be, based on the right that we all have as citizens of this country and of this planet, that we should have access to good education, and that people should be able to get a fully resource education regardless of where they live and where they come from.
I think if anything was hidden in plain sight, the separation between care and education has been. I know that even Valora, when we were together on the board of NAYC, and that was a while ago, all my speeches were about stop separating out childcare and stop calling it daycare, but who's taking care of days, but stop separating out childcare and education. And, that was a long time ago. And here we are a long time later, and we're still doing it. But if anyone thought that school didn't take care of children before the pandemic, they have to know that schools are a form of childcare in this country. Parents couldn't go to work when school is closed. Essential workers really had a problem there, and teachers had a problem teaching their classes and taking care of their own children. So I think that we have to try to build on this readiness that's there. That said, we're moving more toward pre-K and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, pre-K and K, and 5-year-olds being seen as part of the school system, and moving infants and toddlers off to something else. And I think that's a real danger that we have to pay attention to. I think we need to see this as a whole continuum versus these different chunks. And for the documentary that we're making with the Hunt Institute that I spoke about, we are looking at this as a continuum, birth through 18 years old versus trying to chunk it out. And people won't like that, and I've gotten pushback on it, but we're going to do it as one small way of saying that it's different. I think also with the money that is in the system right now, we can begin to make some changes to try to change the way the child care system works. For example, I've been involved in meetings where the leaders in the states around the country, we meet regularly about once a month or every other month, leaders around the country meet and talk about what they're doing. And they're thinking about funding, taking the even though it's one-time money, and tying it to programs, and tying it to quality improvement, and tying it to enhanced salaries and benefits. So you get more money if you give more, if you pay a higher salary, and begin to build, or the money, even though it follows the slot of the child, you give it to the program in a way that follows. So you pay not for enrollment, but you pay for, or not for attendance, but for enrollment. And that way, trying to get a little stability into the childcare system, which was a house of cards we all knew, and really did tumble over in many ways. I think what you did, Tamara, in making sure that you weren't doing what would be going on automatic, and really make sure you took care of your teachers, is so important. But what 50% of what did Rion Alwyn tell me? But 50% of teachers lost their jobs, and all kinds of, particularly in family childcare. There was, in the states that had a lot of family childcare, it was just a huge collapse. So it's been a house of cards. When we build it back, we have to build it back with a lot more stability, because it is the foundation.
Tamara, maybe you can just say a quick word about your program, because many people on this call obviously will not know what's going on in Milwaukee, but and how your program in the community is trying to deal with this very issue.
Yes. So as Roberto and Ellen were speaking, the first thing I thought to my mind was like, bridging the gap. And that's what I think has been missing for a very long time, is the silos that Ellen mentioned. Is, you care and educate children in all environments. And so in Milwaukee, I'm the executive director at Malaika Early Learning Center. And what we've done is we've taken a program for an early care and education program and made it a full spectrum of birth through age 8. And so we started 6 weeks and go through 3rd grade. Was not the original program. Our original program was 6 weeks through 5-year-old kindergarten, which is where everybody seems to think early education stops. But immediately, you know, I had an opportunity to work in childcare, worked in at the public school district. And in my mind, you know, that the thing that bothers me is kids are for no matter where they are. So this separation of how much it costs to provide care and education for a 4-year-old in this space, I was like, this makes absolutely no sense to me. And understanding growth and development, I immediately said, you know, programs should function a little bit different. The mindset has to change as it relates to the care and education that we provide children. Hence, you know, we coined our, we now call ourselves, our vision is ensuring our children are great by the age of 8. So it's great. We talk about great by 8 all the time, but that's where I think the shift needs to happen. Even in in all communities, as Roberto talked about, childcare and schools, now's the time to sit at the table together. And that's where, when I talked about that village mentality, that includes all of the spaces that take care of children and families. We cannot continue to function in those silos, because at some point everybody's going to touch that child and everybody's going to touch that family. Wouldn't it be great if we put all of our heads together and take care of them early, and so the trajectory of their lives would be so much different?
Well, on that note, I want to encourage everybody to look for the link that you can ask questions of our panelists, and in just a few moments. And from there, I want to wrap up and get ready to go to that link. But before we do, I want to just say, this is a real opportunity time, I think, for us to change the game for children and families, to really think about the role of women, as Tamara said. Family leave, it absolutely is an essential component. Thinking about childcare and early childhood education as part of a system, and the 2-generation strategies that we need. We want to give a special thank you to our funder, the Foundation for Child Development. If you are interested in learning more about Generation Alpha, by participating in this webinar, you're able to get a discount on the book using the promo code Valora that's listed on this screen. And so we really want to thank you so much for being part of this conversation about families. And we want to invite you to join us July 1st, where we're going to have a dynamic panel talking about how we can change the game for young Asian children. So be sure to join us then. Meantime, thank you so much for your participation with us. Also, thank you to the CAYL staff who helped to put this together. Please join us now by pressing the link. We'll put you in a Zoom conversation with our panelists right now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the Zoom.